Welcome. You're watching The Spotlight. Now, recent developments in talks regarding the revival of the 2015 Iran deal have offered a glimmer of optimism that a deal may actually be agreed upon. Just before midnight on Monday, in Tehran, Iran sent its promised response to what European Union has called a final text of an agreement to restore the deal, the nuclear deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. Reports indicate that although Iran's response was not a complete yes, but it has made no significant objections and instead seeks more clarifications. In this edition of Spotlight, we will be discussing the different aspects of the revival talks and how Iran can make sure that the assurances offered in the new deal and the lifting of sanctions would still stand if Joe Biden leaves office. To discuss that further, we're joined by political analyst Sayed Mustafa Khoshcheshm, and also journalist and activist and political analyst John Bosnich. Thank you very much, both of you gentlemen, for joining us on this edition. Mr. Khoshcheshm, as far as we know, there are three main sticking points that remain. There's a verifiable removal of sanctions, the guarantees that a deal will be binding regardless of a future U.S. administration, and of course the long-running investigation by the IAEA instigated by Israel, and Iran wants that to be dropped. Of course, Iran says that these are not really big issues for the U.S. to solve. So in your opinion, let's begin with the first one, which is a verifiable removal of sanctions. What are some guarantees that the U.S. can give about the removal of sanctions, and how can Iran make sure that those sanctions have actually been lifted?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, there is a detailed mechanism for doing so. Verification is a complicated process. It takes time because according to the U.S. sanctions, Iranian oil sector is under sanctions. Contracts with foreign parties are already under sanctions. The Iranian shipping industries, the ships, the ports, the different types of insurances that are provided to the Iranian shipping industries, including the P&I, the pollution and indemnity insurances that are, provided by mostly some 95% of them are provided by Lloyd's Insurance Company in London and other insurance companies in London, and also sending the money back to Iran, the banking ties, they are all under sanctions. So if you want to verify removal of sanctions, then you need span of time, weeks or months, because it's not just one cargo. Iran should be able to, sell oil, to load the cargo, the ships, the insurance, the banking ties, the money should be wired back to Iran. So it takes time. And the question might be why this kind of sequencing has been demanded by Iran. Because the last time we did when the JCPOA went into action, Iran was the party that conducted all its, undertakings. And then the Americans started, and they, shrank their part, and they avoided doing their undertakings. So they showed a deceitful behavior. So the party that has left the deal is the Americans, very illegally, of course, even without resorting to the mechanisms that are already in the JCPOA. They didn't do that. So this time they need to provide the verifications. But the problem falls in the assurance, the area of the guarantees. This is very important. There's
Mr.
been a checklist of
Mr. Khoshcheshm, Since you explained the reason for Iran's tough position on the JCPOA, basically the revival talks altogether, I would like to cut you off right there. Hold that thought because we're coming back to this point. But let's bring in our guest from Belgrade, Mr. John Bosnich. Mr. Bosnich, the excessive demands of the United States is basically the reason for Iran's tough stance on the revival talks. How justified do you believe this is, considering what our other guest from Tehran, Mr. Khoshcheshm, just explained?
Well, I respect the comments of your other guest tonight because he's speaking in good faith and referring to the actual deals and offers being made on the table. But I have to speak from experience as a former government advisor in Japan, in Canada, political candidates in the United States and here in Europe, that the standard procedure of the United States is to try to make offers that bring the other party into a situation where the United States can claim, honestly or not, that there's been a violation. And the United States typically tries to accelerate and enhance these claims of violations to create what they call a casus belli, which means the reason for a war. So I recognize that Iran's position on this matter has been in good faith and straight up, but I'm deeply concerned that the United States may be attempting to draw Iran into a situation where it can make a fake claim to cause a conflict. That's the main concern that I have as a former government advisor in the West and now in Europe.
And Mr. Khoshcheshm, that definitely explains why Iran is being so tough this time around coming to the negotiating table, doesn't it?
Yeah, Iran has sustained billions or tens of or hundreds of billions of dollars in damage because of the U.S. withdrawal from the deal. Iran stood loyal to the deal for 14 months after the U.S. Discarded the deal, and Europeans were made promises, but they never made their part. They never held up their end of the bargain, and they just made wars, spoke about their future compliance, but they never did that because they don't do anything against the United States. But this time, Iran wants guarantees that this is not going to happen. Because when you oxidize or oxidate, I don't know which one is the better word, uranium, which is kind of metal, then you may not revive it. You may not bring it back to life. It's gone is gone, cannot be brought back to life again and be useful and effective again. When you dismantle your centrifuge machines and done is done, cannot be undone. They are, nuclear industries are very expensive area of high tech. So Iran has sustained the damage, a lot of damage. Now, there have been many Iranian patients that have lost their lives, especially those with rare diseases, kids with butterfly diseases. Now, because the U.S. reimposed the sanctions on its banking sector, now we need to have guarantees. And let me tell you this, one of the European officials in the latest round of talks, one of the top European leaders, made a couple of promises that we will resolve this because they need oil and energy supplies. So they want to, satisfy Iran, convince Iran that, okay, go for a deal. But let's be honest. We've experienced this before. When the JCPOA was being signed, John Kerry made 1,000 verbal promises to Mr. Zari, and you may not be deceived again, especially not with this government and this new team. We have the experience. We know that verbal promises are good for nothing. So one of the main bones of contention right now is that we are asking them, okay, you said there will be verbal promises. All right, do it in written. Give us your written promises and guarantees. And they resist. And the question is, why? If you are really honest, why are you resisting? Why are you not doing what you said already? Less than a month ago or 2 months ago. And if there is a third area of guarantees that's in between, and it's the main bone of contention standing between the two sides, there are different types of guarantees. When we talk about guarantees, people think that it's just the Congress approval. No, Congress, Biden, Blinken, they just, they can provide the political guarantee, and who cares for the signature of the United States when they already violated the same deal? They don't care about it. It's not just the JCPOA. They violated at the same time, at around the same time. They violated the Paris Climate Accord, NAFTA, transatlantic, the tariff agreement with China, and they escalated into war. And then Open Skies Treaty, also the IMF, the short-range ballistic, nuclear-capable ballistic missiles with Russia. So as you see, and they even withdrew their membership from UNESCO. Some of them had congressional approvals, some not. In just a very short span of time, they discarded everything and started renegotiation with friends, Europeans, Mexicans, Canadians. They were forced to, appease Donald Trump, but the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, their enemies, their rivals, and they didn't agree to give up their sovereignty and independence because they were right. And the one who violated the deal was the United States and not just Donald Trump. Now, what we want is very strong guarantees. There is a checklist. The guarantee is not just the word. And I will explain it later, maybe after my colleague speaks, because
exactly, Mr. Khoshesh. That's the point I wanted to raise right now. We will be discussing what these guarantees can be according to a checklist that you mentioned, and also a list of things that came to my mind as I was taking notes. So we will discuss how the U.S. can give us those guarantees. But let's bring back Mr. Bosnich to see, as you mentioned yourself, Iran is taking part in these negotiations in a good gesture, actually, trying to making a positive gesture on international level. But personally, you've had the experience and you know that it's not necessarily true about the United States. In this case, and at the point that we've reached right now regarding the revival of the nuclear deal, do you believe that the U.S. is willing to give the necessary guarantees, which we will discuss later, in order to in order for Iran to be sure that this deal will stand?
Well, I think that everything is possible, and I believe that Iran has taken a very correct legal approach on this entire matter. The fact that Iran has had for some continuation of time continued to abide by the deal, even though the deal had been canceled unilaterally by the United States, is already a show of good faith on the part of Iran. Secondary, I think the insistence from your other contributor to today's program is that any deal must be in writing. Every detail of the deal must be specified clearly down to the statistical data that they might be requesting, and there must be external guarantors. And when I say external, I mean external to the U.S. empire. Having the contact group from European countries is not really an external guarantor, because those countries in the EU are little more than American military colonies. Their security depends on the United States. The United States helped form the EU, and the United States pressures those countries to say and do as it says. What might be beneficial to Iran in this case is to go forward in good faith, get a very detailed written agreement that is signed and is certified by the United Nations, and then request Russia or China or both to become monitors on the compliance of the deal and bring that in from the Iranian side. Then you've got a deal that has external parties that have great international weight and that they can be performing the function of neutral monitors. And you then have some balance in the agreement, and where there is balance and where there is some sort of countervailing power against the overwhelming power of America, you may be able to achieve a deal. Nothing is impossible if you go into it with a clean heart and an open willingness to cooperate.
Okay, so Mr. Khoshesh, Let's go through that checklist of yours and see what are some guarantees that the U.S. can give Iran. What are some steps that it can take to make sure that even if a deal is dropped, Iran will not suffer as much damage as it did last time?
Basically speaking, we have two different types of guarantees, roughly similar to what my colleague said. Some of the guarantees totally depend on the U.S. or Europeans' good faith and their responsibility, if they are ever responsible, and care for their own signature, no matter what type of guarantees we're talking about. And there is another type that's not in their hands. It's in Iran's hands. Now, what are we talking about? There are different types of guarantees, like the United States president, puts his signature down, or Mr. Blinken as Secretary of State confirms in written or approves and gives his words in written, or the Congress. These are called political guarantees. Yes, they are needed, of course, but nobody cares about U.S. responsibility because they have already proved to be very much irresponsible. They don't, keep their words. As I said, it's not just in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, but they have violated, discarded nearly a dozen other agreements at roughly around the same time, just a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago. Now, there's another type that's called legal guarantees. When the Amaro sanctions started as the first U.S. extraterritorial, sanctions rule, the Europeans warned their companies that if they comply with the Americans' rules, extraterritorial rules, that means they are disrespecting their own sovereignty, their own country's sovereignty. So they warned them, if you pursue their own policy, then we will fine you as much as the Americans would do. But if you stand against the United States, then we will make up for your losses. And they stood against sanctions on Cuba. We've been asking them since last year, why don't you do that with regard to Iran? There are legal mechanisms like this that you can do it. And they've been resisting, and they've not been doing anything. That's why we are suspecting their true intentions. Another type is economic guarantees. European firms, Asian firms, they are demanding us that even if the United States provides you with other types of guarantees, we are not, sure about the Americans because they are very much irresponsible. They would tear up the deal maybe in a few months when the Republicans take the House and, the Congress. So we need guarantees to allow us to stay in Iran after doing the investment for a long period of time without being punished, even if the U.S. discards the deal, even if the JCPOA is gone, no matter what happens. This is very important. And also, this has been one of the bones of contentions. But the only type that you can trust and rely and has a deterrent factor is the one that's in Iran's hand. What is it? It's the nuclear guarantees. That is to say, I'm going to keep my machines, of course, in store under the surveillance of the IAEA. They will not operate, but they will be stored, but on my own soil. I would keep my knowledge, R&D. I would keep my material. They all, will be under the inspection of the IAEA according to the deal. Why? Because if you discard the deal again, I would not sustain any kind of damage, financial, technological damage. Second, that would play as a deterrent factor against the United States. They know that if they drop the deal, if they ever sign it, then Iran can resume its 60% enrichment operation and maybe beyond. That's a deterrent factor. So there are many more types of guarantees, like if Europeans start billions of dollars of investment in Iran in order to, make it very much complicated for the United States to punish their own companies and encourage their own companies to come to the Iranian market. So they can also do lots of other things, but they are resisting. This is the problem. You have given us your verbal words. You
Mr.
have agreed that it should be made very much difficult for the United States to do the same that they did just a few years ago.
Mr. Khoshesh, you mentioned many very important factors that could serve as guarantees for Iran, particularly the last one, and the fact that Iran's enriched uranium is now at 60% enrichment. And basically, we have only time for only one question I'd like to ask Mr. Bosnich. Some observers say that we are getting close to a now or never situation. To what extent do you agree?
Well, in a sense, Iran has done everything possible while maintaining its national sovereignty to come to a peaceful deal on the JCPOA. Iran has bent over backwards. It has had the deal canceled unilaterally from the other side. And not only did the other side unilaterally cancel it, they're continuing to blame Iran. Iran has to simply say, this is it. This is the last time we will deal with you. We are going to sign a contract. It will be certified with the United Nations, and we will bring in external monitors to monitor your monitors and our monitors, and then it's up. If you don't comply with this, it means you don't want a deal, no matter how we've tried. And that's what I would suggest that Iran should do.
Thank you very much, journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich from Belgrade, and political analyst Said Mustafa Khoshesh from Tehran. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of Spotlight. And I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for now. Thank you and goodbye.